Welcome everyone who's already joined. We'll be starting in just a few minutes.
Welcome everyone to this afternoon's event where we're reckoning with the Ukrainian government's armed Nazi militias. The International Action Center is very proud to be here in conversation with author and activist Phil Wilato, coordinator of the Odessa Solidarity Campaign, alongside Leonid Ilderkin, a Ukrainian communist in exile and member of the Coordination Council and the Union of Political Refugees and Political Prisoners of Ukraine. We'll also be hearing a recorded statement from Alexei Albu, a survivor of the massacre at the Odessa House of Labor in 2014, who is currently living in Lugansk. And a little later, we will be joined by longtime anti-war activist and Workers' World Party contributor, Sarah Flounders. My name is Danny O'Brien. I'm an organizer with the International Action Center and Workers' World Party Portland branch. I have a background in the US military. I was a veteran from the Patriot Launching Station air defense system, and I've made quite a big ideological turn in my life. I joined the Army as just a kind of whatever American patriot and thought King of the Hill wasn't satire and Captain America was gospel, and just being in the Army and seeing it from within very quickly started unraveling all of those points of view. And here I am today. So I'd just like to introduce my co-host for this discussion, Teddy Kelly in Philadelphia.
Thanks, Danny, and welcome everyone. I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon. All of us at the International Action Center are really pleased to be able to present this discussion to you because we think it's really important, and we hope that this discussion leads to a greater understanding of the really very complex crisis that is threatening the lives of working class Ukrainians and Russians and many, many more innocent people around the world. Why I want to tell you why we focus on US imperialism and on NATO, and why we think it's such a threat that the region is being flooded right now with weapons and Nazi, truly far right-wing fighters. And it's extremely alarming to see this coalescing of global right-wing neo-Nazi movements unifying in this struggle. And that's why we want to make sure that everyone understands that this is a point of view about the conflict that you're not going to hear on CNN. You're not going to read about it in the New York Times, but we really want you to hear from Ukrainian leftists and longtime anti-war activists themselves to give you this perspective, because we do think this threat is extremely dangerous. Like Danny said, I also grew up in the US and considered myself part of the progressive movement for a long time, but I still wasn't immune to imperialist propaganda. I know myself personally, I was very, very confused about a number of US attacks on countries in the global South. And it wasn't until I had this broader anti-imperialist understanding that folks like the International Action Center share, that I began to really understand the way US empire works. So let me toss it back to Danny now to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Teddy. Our first speaker is Phil Wileto, author and activist, and he's coordinator of the Odessa Solidarity Campaign. Phil.
Thanks very much. And thanks for the invitation to participate in the webinar today. The International Action Center has been in the forefront of anti-imperialist work in this country for 30 years now, and it's an honor to be here. Back in 2016, I traveled to Odessa with two other U.S. anti-war activists, Bruce Gagnon and Regis Tremblay. And we were invited by an organization called the Council of Mothers of May 2, who were relatives and supporters of the people who had been murdered at the House of Trade Unions on May 2nd, 2014. That massacre of progressives by a mob led by openly fascist organizations came just a few months after the February 2014 right-wing coup that was strongly supported by the United States and put into power an anti-Russian, pro-NATO, pro-US right-wing government that came to power with the active support and participation of neo-Nazi organizations. When we got to Odessa, we came as international observers. The Council of Mothers had invited people from a number of countries because they felt that if there were foreigners, particularly from the United States, that perhaps the Ukrainian government would hold back the fascists who were threatening to attack the second memorial that was to be held at the site of the massacre at the House of Trade Unions. One organization had actually applied for a permit to conduct a workshop to train its youth group in the use of pyrotechnics and machine guns at the site of the memorial. And several other organizations were calling on their members to come from around the country and attend the memorial and repeat the massacre of May 2nd. Fortunately, there was enough international attention on that memorial that the Ukrainian government evidently felt it was in their interest to hold back the fascists, but they were there. When the three of us checked in a hotel the day before, there was a group of soldiers out in front, and I asked one of our hosts who they were, and they said, well, that's the Azov Battalion. They're here to give us a welcome. Well, the Azov Battalion has been in the news quite a bit lately because it's a sore point for the Ukrainian government and for the U.S. because it really is a neo-Nazi organization. It was founded in 2014 by a man named Andriy Belitsky, who has a quote from 2010 where he said that it is the mission of the Ukrainian people to conduct a final crusade against Semites and the inferior races to protect the white race. He's known as the white ruler. And he led Azov until he was elected to the parliament in 20, I believe it was 2016. And then he continues to, exert, an informal leadership role. The Right Sector organization came out of the protests at Euromaidan in 2014 that overthrew the elected government. Right Sector, they're called that because they took up their positions on the right section of the square called Euromaidan. And Right Sector had a chapter in Odessa which is a city that, even though it's minority ethnic Russian, it's predominantly Russian speaking. It has a long history. It was founded by Catherine the Great during the time of the Tsarist Empire. It was not a particularly political city, but it did have a Russian flavor to it. And Right Sector set up a chapter where they would regularly harass the Council of Mothers of May 2, who were coming out weekly and monthly in the memorials to the massacre, demanding an international investigation. And the Right Sector group would come out and physically attack them. And this went on for years. Today, we have heard from Ukrainian media. One of them is a mainstream online publication called the Odessa Journal, that the government has clamped down a total curfew on the city of Odessa. No one can leave their homes. Public transportation has been shut down, and there is a police sweep going through the city, arresting anyone they consider to be not sufficiently politically loyal to the government. And the excuse that they're using, they're saying that Russia has planted operatives in Odessa, and they plan to hold a protest today on May 2nd, and that would lead to violent riots with the intention to overthrow the government. This is absolutely insane. Anyone who had any hostile intentions to the Ukrainian government was driven out after the Odessa massacre of 2014. So this is just a complete excuse to crack down on anyone who is uncomfortable with living under a right-wing government that depends on, tolerates, and promotes neo-Nazi organizations like the Azov Battalion and the Right Sector and many others. And Azov was quickly, after 2014, incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard, and they're giving great praise for the role that they're playing in defending their country. But these folks are neo-Nazis, and they're attracting white supremacists from around the world to come and fight with them. And they're committing terrible atrocities that I'm sure Leonid can go into more detail than I can. Today is the International Day of Solidarity with the people of Odessa. It's something that our organization, the Odessa Solidarity Campaign, has called for each year since 2016, since we came back from Odessa. And this year, working with Leonid's organization, the Union of Political Immigrants and Political Prisoners of Ukraine, and the Co-op Anti-War Cafe of Berlin, which has taken a strong position against NATO and against the US role in the present conflict. And our three organizations have been promoting local activities in solidarity with the people of Odessa and their demand for an international investigation. So we know there are protests taking place in several cities across Europe, North America, and in Moscow. We have put out a packet of information, including a webinar that Leonid and Heinrich from the Anti-War Cafe and I put together. And you can find all that information at our website, OdessaSolidarityCampaign.org, OdessaSolidarityCampaign.org. That's all I'll say about this for now, but I hope this is some contribution to people understanding that the image that they have of that they're being given of Ukraine as a pure, struggling democracy that is fighting against a ruthless aggressor. Maybe they'll, even if they don't completely believe everything that we're saying, and people should be skeptical, that they can have a healthy skepticism about the information that they're receiving from the United States government and the US news media, which is marching in lockstep with the State Department line. Thanks very much. And again, I appreciate being here today.
Thank you so much, Phil, for joining us. We really do appreciate it. And we appreciate your efforts in making sure that the reality of the 2014 massacre at the Odessa House of Labor is not forgotten. I want to read very briefly some coverage from Sputnik News about the aftermath of the 2014 massacre. And it reads that Kiev authorities have been hunting down not only the victims of the May Day 2014 massacre carried out by Ukrainian nationalist radicals in Odessa, but also their family members, according to Marina, an eyewitness to those tragic events. She said, throughout the 8 years since the events of May 2014 unfolded in Kulikovo Pole Square in Odessa and the city's trade union house, Kiev has been arresting both the victims of those events and their relations. Initially, this was done to swap them for members of Ukrainian armed forces taken prisoner as they waged their punitive operation against the formations of local militias seeking to defend their homes. The first few such exchanges involved several survivors of the blaze at Odessa's House of Trade Unions. I wanted to read that because we are very honored to have had a statement from one of the survivors of the 2014 massacre at the Odessa House of Labor, Alexei Albu, who is currently living in Lugansk. And it's one of the reasons that he was not able to join us live tonight, though he wanted to, is because of the instability, both of internet connections and of course of the turmoil in the region in general. But we're very glad that we are able to have this statement from Alexei, which we're going to share with you now.
Dear comrades, friends, in 2014 I experienced a terrifying massacre on 2nd of May in Odessa. I was lucky I survived, but many of my comrades, countrymen and like-minded people died that day. It's important to note that this did not happen by accident. The massacre in Odessa is a planned act of intimidation. This was done on purpose to intimidate opposition and is political terrorism perpetrated by the new Ukrainian state, established after the coup d'etat. On the 2nd of May, about 2,000 far-right militants were brought to my hometown in Odessa. They were armed with firearms and edged weapons, had special means of protection. The people who stole into the House of Trade Unions could not fight back because they were unarmed people. These were civilians. But the Nazis set fire to the House of the Trade Unions and did not allow people who wanted to get out of the burning building to escape. My friend, an activist of the Borotba Union, Andrei Brazhevsky, was killed after he jumped out of a window and asked for help with numerous fractures. He was finished off with a metal bar. Video footage of this massacre is widely distributed on internet and can be seen if it is necessary. After this brutal massacre, Ukrainian nationalists were not punished. None of them were arrested or convicted. Instead, for 8 years, they continued to mock the relatives of the victims who came to honor the memory of their relatives at the House of Trade Unions. The Nazis forbade the inhabitants of Odessa to gather, staged provocations, turned on Nazi music with the help of sound amplifying equipment. The mother of the murdered Andrei Brazhevsky was fired from the university where she taught because the Nazis wrote a denunciation of her. After May 2nd, the cheerful and bright city of Odessa, which always joked and laughed, came gloomy and sad. But I'm glad that power of the Nazis will soon come to an end. Ukrainian neo-Nazis die in Donbass every day. Anti-fascists from Russia, Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics destroy our enemies every day. Destroy murderers, rapists, marauders, and I believe that the day will come when justice will prevail. When everyone who is guilty of the massacre of innocent people in Odessa will be brought to justice. Comrades, I thank you for not forgetting. After all, fascism is a common enemy for all mankind. And one day he may knock on your house too. You should know that we will always help you in the fight against neo-Nazism using these forces that we have. Our strength is in our unity. No pasaran.
Very harrowing story. Thank you, Alexei. Even though you can't be here today, I think your words have traveled the way they need to. Next, we have Leonid Ilderkin. He's a Ukrainian communist in exile, a member of the Coordination Council of the Union of Political Refugees and Political Prisoners of the Ukraine. Just for your information, Leonid is experiencing some internet connections. That's what we have to go through to have these international calls. So just gives a little patience if he happens to cut out. And without further ado, take it away, Leonid.
Hello, dear friends and comrades and colleagues. I hope the internet connection will allow me to speak so you could hear and the speech will be clear. And now we commemorate the Odessa tragedy, which happened in 2014 in the 2nd of May. There are many facts about this, and especially as our friend Phil Vilaito from Richmond, Virginia, presented to you, we, so to say, pay attention to this event specifically. And there is also facts and articles and stories published in the Odessa Solidarity Campaign site and in many other media. But the point of today is not only point for the past, because we commemorate the tragedy that happened in the past, and it was really needed. It is still very much needed, and in future to remember this event, this tragedy, and have lesson from this. But past is gone. We need to understand and evaluate the present and see the future. And the present is such that the example of violent attacks on opposition, but not even opposition as a position of activity, opposition of thinking. This type of attacks on somebody who thinks different, on somebody who is opposing the ideas of ultranationalism, which travels into plainly pure Nazism from that time in Ukraine until now, and it stays there. These repressions that happened then went into great scale throughout all of these years of the regime, settled after the coup d'etat happened as a result of the clashes in the central square called Maidan in Kiev. I was eyewitness myself, all of this from the very beginning, from November, late November of 2013. And I could see who were the forces joined to these clashes against that time government of Ukraine. That events of 2013 and 2014 gave type of revival, or in greater sense, resurrection to the ideas and activities of plainly Nazism, Nazist practices. And for now, they went to the, so to say, some type of final point, final several stages of their development. They demolished completely all types of political opposition in Ukraine, and they hunt in a much greater scale than throughout all of these 8 years of the past. They hunt for everyone who just do not like them. We need to remind and we need to raise the question of the actual disaster in Ukraine in terms of human rights, for right for another thought, another opinion even. They arrest and place to detention and place to the places which we do not know, because many people just disappear without any information about them. They arrest now thousands of people who do not like them, or somebody who they suspect in type of not loyalty to this regime. What to say about prohibition of any other political force besides only one, so to say, groups that support the regime. Regime itself has origin from the oligarchic competition between each other. There, in the highest echelon of Ukrainian, so to say, elite. That elite basically had groups that did not like each other, and then it went into clashes between them at first. But then, because the neo-Nazis see this as an opportunity to gain power in the country, they start to develop themselves very well with the great funding from one or another elite groups. And for now, there is only one group of elite, one group of oligarchy that just demolished everybody else. Our struggle as communists, socialists, and even social democrats were not in the beginning against them, because their fight with each other was not ours, so to say. But then Nazis start to attack and persecute and hunt for every progressive forces, for every left who was, so to say, left in Kiev, and then in the rest of the country, the resistance grew up against it. The resistance came through all Ukraine. In some of places, it was smaller. In some of places, it was bigger. In some places, it was successful, and people could have gained, in that time, in 2014, they could have gained almost people's power in some places. But it was quickly lost because bourgeois state was not, so to say, it did not sleep for all of this time. It woke up. The new elite that came into Ukraine, it's wrong to say such. The groups of old elite who defeated their competitors, they start to persecute all kinds of opposition. And we had in such cities as Kharkov and Mariupol and also Odessa and other places, in many places, in Dnipropetrovsk, in Zaporozhye, we had people almost overtake the power from the central government of Kiev. But then these mostly peaceful attempts, they were completely defeated, demolished by the armed force, and at most this was neo-Nazi militias that took back these cities from civil protesters. And the only places there the protesters against the regime of Kiev could stay and beat out all of the attacks of the central government, that were only Donetsk and Lugansk. There, we can say the resistance went into success completely, but eventually it went to the escalation of civil conflict. People took arms, but the opponents, the neo-Nazis, the militias of the oligarchy that were in most of cases employed because they were paid and they were armed. These opponents, they were basically, they took the rest of the country by force. They start to implement, they start to shoot first first of all, in Kiev, when they did the coup, then they attacked that time government forces. They start to shoot from rifles, from machine guns, and then it was this bloodshed went to the rest of the country. When we remember Odessa, 2nd of May, Odessa massacre there, we must also remember Mariupol, 9th of May of 2014, when these Nazi militias shoot from machine guns onto unarmed crowds of protesters. The number of victims of Mariupol of 2014, we do not know. But the resistance there was, so to say, they were literally shoot on the street. So to say, they were literally pushed out by arms. That gave us another, so to say, stage of resistance. There was already in this time, by summer of 2014, there was already front lines around Donetsk and Lugansk and armed struggle there. But in the rest of the country, we had already what is called underground resistance. Underground resistance, which was realistically an attempt, but it also was not very successful because it was easy for the state government machine of violence to basically demolish almost all underground. And then even during these 8 years of the civil conflict in Ukraine, still many brave people, bold people, raised their voices against the regime, especially for support of workers' rights that were oppressed completely during the rule of previous president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, and especially during the rule of the present-day president of Ukraine, Zelensky. Workers' rights there demolished to the dust. There were protests about it. And now I will tell you about one person, which is like a symbol of our resistance now there in the central Ukraine and the central north. His name is Alexander Matyushenko, personal friend of mine, geography teacher. I knew him from 2009. Then in March, their pictures came into internet. Then they came and arrested this person just because he was in communist groups long ago, in about 2014. But you see the level of cleansing. They come and arrest somebody who is not actual do something, who is only potential different from this Nazi ideology, that ideology of national superiority, which in Ukrainian context means ethnical superiority. In English world, what is called nation? Nation, it's like people living in some country. In Russian, Ukrainian sense, nation, it means such particular ethnicity. And then we speak about nationalism in Ukraine, which means ethnical superiority over everybody around. Everybody else are not much needed. There's ethnical superiority. This is what is Ukrainian nationalism is about. It's not the nationalism which is terminology of, so to say, Western mind. It is such another type of nationalism. And we can call it extra, ultra nationalism or neo-Nazism. And neo-Nazism there, they have even in symbols. So the call of tomorrow, today we finish the commemoration, the day is coming to the end. Commemoration day of Odessa massacre is gone. We had many events across the world in such countries of Western Europe, and of course in Donetsk and Lugansk Republic, and of course in Moscow. I myself, together with the friends, including our foreign supporters, we participated today in 2 rallies for commemoration of Odessa. And there are such events in North America as well and in South America. But tomorrow we need to think about actual prisoners who are under torture in often we do not know where are they. Where are those people gone? Like it is in the biblical story when it was Cain and Abel, and then Cain killed Abel, and then somebody comes and asks Cain, where is your brother? Where are those people who are disappeared now in Ukraine? Only because by suspicion somebody in Ukrainian government or somebody in Nazi militias suspect them of not being loyal to the regime. I don't know if I speak too long. Just tell me when I must finish. About Azov regiment. Azov regiment is only one of the groups of neo-Nazis. The most celebrated one, of course, even more than the right sector. And you need to understand, when you say Azov battalion, it's like it is old. It's old words. Azov is an army. They have armed, trained, and very well supplied regiment in every major city. And these Azov regiments, they are the core of the Ukrainian. It's like something which holds the regime of Kiev. When we say now there is war between Russian and Ukrainian, that's deeply wrong to say such as well, because the bigger forces, by number and by experience, the bigger forces come against regime of Kiev from territories of Ukraine, and those are people of Ukrainian citizenship, people of Donetsk and Lugansk. By number, they are bigger than advancing Russian forces who are just around, and they are more motivated, of course, because they remember shelling of Donetsk and Lugansk area, which consists, it's about 4.5 million people there. And shelling there was every day on civilians, on cities, and this gave motivation to these people to bring revenge now, in a sense, against the regime of Kiev, to finally stop this. And the origin of this war is civil conflict, and the continuation of this war is civil conflict as well, despite of the fact of Russian intervention on behalf of Donetsk and Lugansk. Intervention did occur, but remember civil war in Spain. Then fascist forces of General Franco was supported by divisions, army divisions of fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Soviet Union also sent some of significant force into Spain. Well, when the Republican Spain unfortunately lost. But remember, for instance, Vietnam War. Vietnam War, there was north of Vietnam, socialist and communist by idea, and there was south of Vietnam. And that was type of civil war there between these two. So who you choose? Do you choose to support somebody of the, imagine, north of Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh, or somebody there in south of Vietnam, this regime of Lon Nol, which, by the way, had so much of supply from USA, amazingly great supply from USA, and stole from US government amazingly great money. And finally they fell anyway, because they were, so to say, not only not right, but they were kind of just unable, corrupt regime who did not want to continue. But the war took in Vietnam for about 20 years with USA involvement only, and for about 15 years with French involvement. I made mistake by dates, by numbers, but there was war against French occupation, anti-colonial war. And then after this war, there was a war against south of Vietnam, supported by USA by amazing, enormous amount of supply and troops and money and everything. And they lost.
That's
We
right.
are confident. The regime of Kiev will lose because we know who are they. We know how much they trick all of these Western powers. Western powers are not naive. This war is very profitable for somebody. So much profitable that it is very easy to understand completely. It is so much transparent to understand why they start to, to make this weapon supply, to empty European warehouses, send something old there to Ukraine, bring something new from USA and pay for it. It basically demolishes European wealth. But there are another thousands of reasons why to keep this regime of Zelensky ugly, the ugly dictatorship that demolished and killed and tortured all the opposition. Now they support them and rejoice about it because it is so much profitable. This is the origin. This is the present stage of this war. But
and it's such a perfect transition. Yeah.
For us, for Ukrainian opposition, this is our civil war, like it was for Republican Spain, their civil war against fascist Franco, with whoever's help. Soviet Union, okay. French volunteers, okay. Hemingway from USA, okay. But that was their war. Same it is now. It is our war against the regime of Kiev, regime of murderers. And remember, north of Vietnam. Who you like more? North Vietnamese with Ho Chi Minh or South Vietnamese, whoever there was, with Lon Nol, with somebody who is just even ugly to think about.
I think that is such, comrade, that is such you've given us such a nuanced understanding of the complexities of this conflict. And then you bring us to such an important question, which is, which side are you on? And why would you ever want to find yourself on the side of these right-wing fanatics? And we've seen in the US in recent times with the attempt to take the US Capitol on January 6th. I mean, people in the US need to imagine if these forces who we've seen committing hate crimes and becoming more and more active, if they were as powerful as the right-wing militias are in Ukraine, what a threat it would be to our movements. Leonid, I can't thank you enough for this explanation, and we want to get back to you in the Q&A too. It is such a pleasure once again to have you, and thank you so much. And it's great also to know that the liberation struggle of Vietnam after so many decades is still inspiring all of us. I want to bring in now a longtime anti-war activist who has been fighting against US imperialism here and abroad since the time of the Vietnam War, and someone who I've learned so much from, Sarah Flounders.
Well, thank you, Teddy, and thank you to Leonid, because I really think you tied so much together. Now, why do we mark an anniversary of this horrendous crime? Why can't we just ignore it and move on? But clearly, as Leonid shows, this memory and the continuing everyday threat is still alive. These forces, extreme right-wing Nazi forces, dominate the parliament, the whole government apparatus, command the police force, command the military, entire units, and they're armed, trained, organized by the US military. They make no bones about it. They show pictures again and again of them teaching the use of Javelin missiles, SAM shoulder-to-air missiles, sending the latest technology. Now, everyone who knows even their high school history knows that every US war is fought with a saturation of propaganda that just blankets all the media with stories of massacres, rapes, and terrible crimes committed by whoever is the targeted country. And then later it's admitted that this is just stories, just propaganda. Now, this is true, and as Leonid reminded us, in Vietnam, acutely, in Korea, in Iraq, where we heard howling stories of babies ripped from incubators and weapons of mass destruction. We can think of all the horrendous crimes we heard in Afghanistan, in Syria with gas attacks to justify huge US military operations. We know when we say again and again that the US operates more than 800 military bases around the world, outside the borders of the US, 800 military bases. But they also maintain armies of all different nationalities and well-paid journalists whose role is to churn out war stories, propaganda, justification for wars. And what happens at the end of every one of these wars? They're big defeats for the US. And what do they do with their collaborators? They just leave them behind in the dust. They're disposable. And this is true in the Ukraine. It will be true. Now, Scott Ritter, on an earlier webinar that we were part of, he's a US military analyst, and he described, he's an opponent of the current US war against Russia. He explained in some detail the CIA programs to absorb these fascist organizations at the end of World War II. The entire units, brigades, the whole command structure was taken over by the US, was given protected status, was continued to be armed. And these Nazi units operated in the Ukraine up until 1955, when they were finally defeated. And then 35 years later, in 1990, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the division into separate republics, these forces were brought back, very well funded, whole new, and they had been maintained. There were training camps and camps for the young people in the US, here in New York State, and in Canada, in the years between. And now they're brought back to the Ukraine. So what did they do there? What did they do, especially since the 2014 coup? There was also a US orchestrated coup in 2004. We shouldn't forget there's many efforts to just pull the Ukraine in. What was the most prosperous of the republics is today the poorest. How did that happen? That's what happens with US domination. Ukraine is today the poorest country of Europe, and yet it was the most prosperous of the Soviet republics. Industry, agriculture. So we can see what happens, and I think Leonid has explained so well that today the US arming, training, they brag about it in every news article. You can open up a newspaper, watch on TV, they will show you the new weapons that the United States is sending, and that it's an endless supply, and that they're spending billions and billions of dollars and taking it directly from social programs here, from COVID relief, from medical care, from student debt programs that were to be forgiven, and now there's no money because it's all going to arms, the biggest source of profit. So there is a real affiliation between the US war and the Nazi organizations in the Ukraine. That's who keeps it alive. And yet, suddenly, even though the US media acknowledged this again and again in the years past and talked about the Nazi problem in the Ukraine, suddenly to even mention it is called Russian propaganda. It's suddenly declared a fiction. So we need to stand up to this. We need to stand up and even remind Oliver Stone's documentary, simply snatched offline. The articles from AP and Reuters and Atlantic Council and on, talking about the Nazis in the Ukraine. Today, hard to find. Why is that? Because now it's full blown and they're using these forces. All of this is to impose the most horrendous sanctions on Russia and to force the European Union into breaking every tie and every trade arrangement with Russia. Now, that is super profitable to US corporate power. And it is also a weapon against the European Union. It's not to their benefit. So this is a war for markets, for US corporate domination. It will mean famine in Africa, as grain shipments stop, as the price of oil and gas and cooking oil even escalates beyond the hand of so many people to use. I hope we'll have a little bit of time today to also talk about where this war is going, because it's become clear as even Nancy Pelosi visits Ukraine, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, one after the other, they're all traveling to Ukraine. And every one of them has statements about how this will be a long war, how they're going to continue this war, how they're going to continue to ship the weapons. And yet there is a level of resistance that I think Leonid has explained very deeply and that has held firm all these years in Lugansk, in Donetsk, really a resistance that the struggle today wouldn't be possible, except that the local people held on. They refused to accept this fascist government. But the losses were great when you consider what happened in Odessa. So where the war is going, I think we need to clearer and clearer say, this is a war for profits. It's a war to impose sanctions on whole, and yet 3/4 of the world is refusing the sanctions on Russia. So it's a big global international conflict at this time. And in this, the fascist forces are fully aligned with US military aid. And making that distinction, explaining that this imperialist system needs war, is driven to war, and yet it can be resisted when there's organized workers' movements. So I want to thank Alexei, who had to send us a message under such difficult circumstances, couldn't even be sure they would have a stable link. Leonid, who's with us under difficult conditions where links break again and again. And Phil, who's helped to keep the Odessa commemoration alive all of these years. So let's continue what is a difficult task, but it is not impossible, as we know from past anti-war struggles. As a real price of it becomes clear here, that propaganda begins to erode and real questions begin. So we shouldn't just think of this stage of the war. We have to really take a view of how in the past we've done it, the importance of the most basic explanations, these webinars, union resolutions, and coordinated activity. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, everybody, for your remarks. We're going to shift into the Q&A section now. So I'm just going to invite all our hosts and panelists to turn on their camera and be ready for some questions. And I'd like to kick us off with a question, just a simple question for Phil. How can people get more involved in the Odessa Solidarity Campaign?
Well, I'll answer that, but the broader question is, what can they do to help the situation as a whole? The Odessa Solidarity Campaign is a small organization, and it's sponsored by the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality, which has been involved in the anti-war movement since our founding 20 years ago. You can go to our website, odessasolidarity.campaign.org, and we've got posted there a packet of information that hopefully will help to explain the processes and events that led up to the present crisis, the steady expansion of NATO to the very borders of Russia, and the US support for the 2014 coup that brought an anti-Russian, pro-NATO, pro-US, fascist, tolerant, at least, government to power, all of which set the stage, where Russia felt that it was only a matter of time before it would either be militarily attacked or its government would be overthrown through one of these orchestrated so-called color revolutions. And they responded. The Odessa Solidarity Campaign is not endorsing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but neither are we condemning it. We're trying to explain the events and process that led up to it. We would be more than happy to help provide materials and advice, anything, support that we can to any organization that wants to begin to raise the issue of the fascist movement in Ukraine and what happened on May 2nd, 2014, which exposes so much about the reality of Ukraine that is diametrically opposed to the image that we're being fed by the mass media. But I think in general, we call on all progressive organizations, no matter what issues they work on, to incorporate anti-war activism and education in their work. The anti-war movement cannot be divorced from the domestic struggles, and those who work primarily on domestic issues cannot ignore what the government is doing in their name, with their money, with the lives of our sons and daughters overseas. There has to be an integrated, holistic movement that rallies around the slogan, "Stop the wars at home and abroad." I know that's what the perspective of the International Action Center, that's the perspective of the Virginia Defenders. And I think if that were the perspective of the anti-war movement as a whole, we would have a much deeper roots in the communities and in the working class as a whole. So whether or not you consider yourself part of the anti-war movement per se, if you are a progressive, if you are a leftist, if you're an activist, please educate yourself and incorporate some anti-war education and work into your program. That is what we need going forward.
Thanks so much, Phil. I wanted to ask another question that came up in the Q&A, and I want to thank everybody for participating in the chat during this event. It's really heartening to see so many positive comments, thanking Phil, thanking Sarah, thanking Leonid in particular for your comments. And we had a question too, that I think these two things are related, that we might want to talk about, which is I don't think it's widely known in the US, among workers in the US, just how many Russian speakers there are in Ukraine. And I wonder if a number of our panelists could also talk about how the dissolution of the Soviet Union led to the rise of more far-right organizations like we're seeing now in Ukraine. I know maybe Leonid, maybe Sarah, you might want to take some of these.
Well, all right, I'll take one stab, and I think Leonid, from the view here in the US, and I think Leonid would also have a view to how this played out in the Ukraine. But we should never forget that what's called Cold War against the Soviet Union, from its very existence to the invasion by 14 countries after the Russian Revolution, to the 70 years. The Cold War was 70 years of nonstop war. The Cold War was a real war. It was more than 70 years of US and EU sanctions, where all technology that could help to modernize, to reconstruct, to rebuild the country the region most destroyed by World War II, had on their own to rebuild. So the sanctions, more than 70 years, they were real against the Soviet Union, against all the countries of Eastern Europe. The 70 years was also an erosion of a lot of the revolutionary consciousness. There was 70 years of every attempt to sabotage socialist planning. There were years and decades of infiltration by NGOs, use of propaganda. This was a war on every front. And it is a war that did lead to the collapse because there was a whole current that developed within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that they could make a deal, that NATO wouldn't expand, that they could disarm, that they could withdraw Soviet troops from Eastern Europe, and NATO would not expand, that it was possible to make a deal with imperialism and end the Cold War and modernize. And of course, that's not what happened. As soon as there was a withdrawal and a step down, there was an aggressive move forward. There was an expansion of NATO right to the borders of Russia. There was an absorption of all the countries. And this includes the Ukraine, includes Georgia, it includes Poland and Hungary and Romania. It includes the three Soviet former republics on the Baltic Sea. This expansion of NATO, and at the same time, a pumping in of money, funding to right-wing organizations that impacted the schools and the laws that were written, that impacted the constitutions and the laws on property, while everything that was socially owned was sold off at rock bottom fire sale prices, privatized, and a lot of it just turned into scrap metal. It was really the first armed resistance to NATO that took place in Lugansk and Donetsk. Workers' organizations that said, no, we're not going to allow you to just seize our industries and shut them down and be taken over by fascist forces. This was the first real resistance to NATO that happened in an organized way. And it's why it's still saluted to this day, and it continues to this day. So, and we shouldn't assume that that memory, a revolution has deep impact, will not reassert itself. But we do have to say right now it's a struggle against total Nazi control and an effort to literally expand the war inside of Russia. And that's where the shells fall now. So, but I'm sure Leonid will have also a description of this, but when folks call for Russian forces to withdraw, what do they really mean? Is that there should be a surrender to the Nazi forces. And once a war is engaged, once there's finally a resistance, do you collapse in the face of it or go forward, even when it's very difficult?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, please go ahead, Leonid.
Dear friends, could you please repeat the point of the question again? As far as I understand, the question is about the current situation in Ukraine. How it is? Could you please remind?
That's right. Yeah. How the current situation in Ukraine has roots to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and how that event led to the rise of more right-wing, armed right-wing militias.
Thank you very much. This is very needed to understand the roots of the situation. The roots lay in capitalist nature of all the territory, which was used to be former Soviet Union, and then it switched to capitalism. Reasons for that, it's a matter of very deep study, but we see the fact. From 1991, it switched to capitalism in such a switch. Like, it didn't happen in one day, it happened within about 2 years before 1991. 2 years. Deeper, we can say that Soviet Union was not completely socialist country. It had prevailing elements of socialism, but still kept market economy, kind of oppressed, but alive. This market economy was one of the roots of the final collapse of Soviet Union as a socialist country. Soviet Union could have been even after. They could have implementation of capitalism, but on some another form. But what happened. In Soviet Union from 1991, capitalism shows its worst phase. This country that includes Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, but Belarus is another story. But this country in general, and Central Asian countries, and Caucasian countries, and Baltic countries as well, although they joined European Union, but look what European Union did to them. Demolition of all possible industry, depopulation of Baltic countries, of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. But let us speak about bigger place, about Russia and Ukraine. They are big. And they were highly industrialized, especially Ukraine. Number of the industrial working class with great education and great skills grew up in Ukraine during the time of Soviet Union. New production lines were gradually opened. What to say? Just one note. The sole aircraft of Navy of Russia was built in Ukraine during time of Soviet Union. The sole aircraft of Navy of People's Republic of China was built in Ukraine during time of Soviet Union. And the only one, aircraft carrier, this is what I'm talking about, of India was built in Ukraine in the time of Soviet Union, in the shipbuilding place of city of Nikolaev, which is now under siege. And this is the level of production Ukraine had then. Another example, all of spaceships of Soviet Union were built in Ukraine, in my city of Dnipropetrovsk. There is called Southern factory. This, and I cannot explain it in English, but there was huge factory to build missiles and spaceships, and other great technological achievements were present in Ukraine because of the great attention from Soviet Union to have industrial capacity to be able to supply all of the parts of Soviet Union with needed up-to-date, so to say, supplies, with including all kinds of electronics, etc. All of this was destroyed by capitalism. Why? Because capitalism wants profit above all. Profit above all. They didn't want to develop these technologies, etc. They start to, whoever was able to obtain another factory, they just start to cut the machines on pieces and sell them out to Turkey, to Europe as useless metal, how we call it, scrap or something. But if you ask about the origin of the fascism of Ukraine, it did not come at once from 1991. It was like very little fire in that time, but it came more and more with the sharpening of competitions between different capitalist groups. And also, we must admit that both Russia and Ukraine, they were not recognized as type of equal countries to cooperate with by great Western powers. They were recognized as almost countries of status of semi-colony. With Ukraine, it went into such a situation towards about year 2000, 2001, when Ukraine started to become a country which exports to the capitalist market almost only raw materials, even steel production, which was great in Ukraine. like the one which was destroyed now in Mariupol. There they still made fortress out of great steel plant, and there are also great steel plants, not only Mariupol, but Lugansk, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporozhye, many of them, because there was coal mines, there was a great number of great reserves of coal, black coal to burn, and ore, iron raw material, ore and coal. There it was all of this together. What happened after? The products, capitalist owners didn't want to develop. It takes money and time to develop better, sophisticated products. Better to sell only bars of steel abroad, better to sell it cheap and pay to their workers in steel industry. And if you have ever been to the steel works, it is like hell. You go inside, and there's fire everywhere. For all of this, it's like very not easy to be inside and even to be near. But they were paid very little. Coal miners were paid very little, and it was strike after strike of coal miners in Ukraine. And so with others. So by paying so very, very little, and by making their products cheap, Ukraine capitalism could become such an exporter of raw materials, and also sunflower seeds, sunflower oil. After sunflower, soil must rest, the field must rest for 7 years after sunflower crop is taken. And they did not do this. Of course, they put another crops in order to have quick profit after profit. That made many of them rich. That made the conflict between them, within these competing groups. That made this country of Ukraine as a country from the highly industrialized and with sophisticated technology. This made Ukraine a semi-colonial country, as it was for us in Soviet Union. It was always great pity to look into some country of South America, like some country which is plainly exploited by capitalism, or some countries of Africa. And there was also such regimes, like for instance, Fresner in Paraguay, like other regimes, like in Argentina, there was a fascist government in 1980s and 1970s, like others, of course, Chile and others in South America, which was semi-colonial, which were exploited, which were, so to say, used to give to the rest of the capitalist world, to the main capitalist countries. They used to give like raw material, mostly this ore, this wood, etc., etc. So become with Ukraine. Russia also was in just the same conditions until about 2003. Then they start to kind of capitulate themselves. They start to be more advanced. And until now, if you compare life, besides war, before civil conflict in Ukraine, in 2013, if you go from Ukraine to Russia, you see this is poor country, Ukraine. Poor country, low wages, very hard to live. You live, the salary was there enough to eat. That's about such. I had 2 jobs in Ukraine. Then in that time, in time of peace, I had myself 2 jobs. And I have 2 higher educations, and I can work with 9 languages, and etc. 2 jobs I had. Went to 2 jobs. After I get in this money, it was luxury, matter of luxury for me to visit cinema more than once in a month, and for me to buy yogurt in the shop more than twice in a month. That was matter of luxury to me. And imagine that was so for millions of workers and peasants. How much explosive it created from the population within decades. But this is one feature only. So the semi-colonial status of Ukraine gave the bourgeois in Ukraine, the higher echelon, such a feeling that they must obey to some type of master. And for them, becomes like this. Some of them wanted to, so to say, deal with Moscow, deal with Russian, because Russian can give them supply of cheap fuel. It's not in Ukraine so much, but cheap fuel is needed for steel production, for production of, for instance, fertilizers, which Ukraine is. It had several great factories of fertilizers from Soviet Union time. Now they are closed because not only there is war around and seaports are closed, but there is no cheap natural gas supply anymore from Russia. What the rest of the world will do without fertilizers supplied from Ukraine to Africa, to Asia, to Latin America, hunger can come to a war. Not in easy scale, but in great scale, unfortunately. That's great misfortune of this situation. Hunger, which will bring millions of people to the edge of surviving. But this is one thing. So then part of bourgeois were for alliance more or less with Moscow, yes, and bigger part of bourgeois, bigger part of highest echelon, wanted to have alliance with European Union, USA, and whoever else there who supply them, who buy this cheap product of steel, etc., and give them money and give them type of protection. And eventually this turned to be into situation then foreign rule become actual in Ukraine, not the rule of somebody from inside of the country. And this foreign rule of some master from abroad, we can say it is European Union, but now it is not so much, not the European Union very much. It's somebody else there. So we can say this is one of the root of the very sad story of Ukraine. And for foreign master, what is needed there? It is needed that somebody who stay there in place in Kiev, for instance, they should obey and not nothing else, but obey. This plainly colonialism. And our fight now, that's in the sense it is for independence of Ukraine and fight against such a colonialism, which demolishes country by every means. Worse, even worse than this Stroessner of Paraguay and Pinochet in the Chile and etc. Even worse. Now it is not only demolition like by exploitation. Now Ukraine becomes a testing field for weapons of every kind of you can imagine, except of nuclear. But I'm sorry, this can be done as well. And this story about this is very sad. But until now, it is out of consideration. So to say, it did not happen yet. But the fact is such, every possible testing of weapon, the most advanced weapons, happens now in Ukraine very much. So this is about such.
Such an interesting point, Leonid, and the way that you help frame the status that Ukrainian workers have been put in these terms makes so much sense. And how grotesque it is that Ukrainians are now being faced with being the test subjects for these weapons. It makes me think about the struggle for liberation of the people of Palestine and Gaza in particular, how often they also are being made to be the test subjects for these new methods and technologies of oppression. I think we had one more question for everyone from Danny, and then we can go to closing statements if anyone has any other remarks they'd like to make.
Yeah, we just had a question in the chat talking about China. Just, is China next? What do y'all think about this?
Sarah, that might be a question you can take on.
Well, if you follow the US media and US commentators and their big strategic think tanks, they'll tell you that's exactly where this is going. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the recent visits to Taiwan, where they're asking, can they begin a confrontation that could be like Ukraine, because they're daily increasing the funds and the weapons to Taiwan. A separatist movement, always been part of China, acknowledged as such, even by the people of Taiwan. But what does the US really want to break, and what is their problem? This is, the United States has 4 to 5% of the world population, but by far the world's largest military, huge number of military bases, and a giant economy. Its problem is that it is being surpassed by the productive capacity of China. This is a huge problem for US capitalists. They don't say, oh, the world is becoming more productive. Oh, here's a country that has ended hunger for its own people, and through the Belt and Road program is opening up development possibilities around the world. No, they don't say that. They say this is a direct threat to the control of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and our ability to dictate conditions around the world. So they are very threatened by China today, by China's development, and especially in the immediate sense, China's refusal to go along with the sanctions imposed on Russia. And because China refused and has an economy to continue to trade and exchange and do development projects around the world, India also refused. So did Bangladesh, Pakistan, countries throughout Asia. So surprisingly, did all the countries of Africa refuse the sanctions that the US imposed on Russia. So did most of the countries of Latin America. Not only those who were sanctioned, but even other countries that have developing economies did not want to accept US imposed sanctions on Russia because they have another way to go. They have another direction to turn. And now there can be, as Russia insists, that oil be paid for in rubles, and that there are even to credit card arrangements. You can shut down SWIFT banking to Russia, but they're able to set up exchanges with China and with other countries based on all sorts of other currency exchanges. So the world is no longer totally held by US domination. Now, this raises the level of risk and threat, but very much what is happening in Russia is directed at China. Will it succeed? So far in the world, it is not succeeding. The US insisted countries boycott who were meeting at the G20, that they exclude Russia. No one accepted. They tried to organize a walkout. Only Britain and Canada walked out with them at a G20 meeting. So they no longer call all the shots because there are other economic options for countries around the world. And as I say, 3/4 of the peoples of the world have refused the sanctions. It is becoming a dividing question in the European Union because they know their own future. They've now been put firmly under the thumb of US imperialism. And that's not a very happy place even for the German imperialists. They are willing to be capitalist looters, absolutely. But their freedom to maneuver has certainly been restricted. So at any rate, this is much part of a much larger struggle. I think the others here will want to comment on this. And as I say, Leonid will recognize and know even the conditions in the Ukraine But yes, I do think it's directed very much at China and trying to break relations between Russia and China and break all the exchanges that Russia had with the world. And so far, it is not succeeding. Russia is able to sell its oil and gas and its agricultural products around the world. It's more difficult. It's more difficult without the facilities that existed through globalization, but it's still continuing. There has been an inability to shut down totally the economy of Russia. And it's because there is cooperation between Russia and China. And I think that's to the good.
We're coming up on 3:30 Eastern time. I know it's getting later for Leonid, but I want to encourage our panelists, Leonid, Phil, Danny, Sarah, if you have any closing remarks you'd like to make before we end for this afternoon. I want to thank you all again for joining us, and thanks everybody for watching along with us. Go ahead, Phil.
If I could make one point. Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I noticed a number of people in the chat are saying, yes, I understand the role of the US. Yes, I understand the right-wing groups in Ukraine, but this guy Putin, we really, he's really a bad guy. He really has to be stopped. And we all know there's a great deal of confusion in the progressive movement over the crisis in Ukraine, and people seem to be looking for the good guy to rally around. And sometimes things aren't quite that clear. President Putin is the leader of a capitalist state that is under pressure from its capitalist competitors, and he's trying to defend his country territorially and economically. He's also an authoritarian figure who has cultivated relationships with right-wing extremist groups across Europe, in particular Marie Le Pen of the National Front in France. He's no friend of the working class, but he is forced to defend his country in order to maintain his own position. When we organized against the US war in Iraq, starting in 1991, we didn't say, we're doing this because we support Saddam Hussein. We did it because we opposed US imperialism. We didn't defend Uganda because we were great fans of Idi Amin. We opposed US imperialism in Africa. We here in the United States live in the most privileged country in the world, privileged because it has pillaged the rest of the world. It's not a country, it's an empire. China has one foreign military base and 2 aircraft carriers. Russia has 1 aircraft carrier and 8 foreign military bases. The United States has, it's either 11 or 12, I think they're building one, aircraft carriers and 800 military bases in 70 countries and a presence in another 80 countries. This is not a country, it's an empire. And those of us who live here have a responsibility to everyone else on the planet to oppose the attempts by the United States ruling class to achieve what they call full spectrum dominance, which used to be called hegemony, but it's basically world domination. And they do it for one reason and one reason only, to guarantee the maximization of profits by US corporations and banks. It doesn't matter if Putin is a good leader or a bad leader. What matters is we do not want the United States to bring Russia down to the level of a neo-colony. We do not want this ruling class that can stand by and watch a police officer murder George Floyd on television, showing the video, and do nothing about it until there are rebellions. We don't want that ruling class to control the world. We want a multipolar world. We want a socialist world. But before we get there, it'll be nice to have a multipolar world in which the US can't call the shots on everything. So we oppose the US proxy war against Russia. We oppose the expansion of NATO. We oppose the sanctions against Russia and any other country. And we will defend any country under attack by US imperialism, and reminding ourselves that it's not our jobs as citizens and residents of the imperialist center of the world to straighten out the internal affairs of other countries. Let the Russian people solve any problems they have in Russia. Just get the hell out of the rest of the world, and everyone will be better off.
Bravo. Bravo, Phil. And thank you so much, Phil Waleto, for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Leonid, would you like to say anything in closing?
I totally agree with our friend Phil Waleto, and especially when he reminded what can happen there in the USA when we could see this brutal murderers, brutal occasions of murdering people of color. We are Ukrainian opposition, immigrants, but not only in immigration, Ukrainian opposition stretched also throughout the country, even if the underground is almost completely repressed. When what happened there in USA with the occasion of murder of George Floyd, we were the first who went into our international community, and Sarah Flanders knows and Phil knows, we have like international community of supporters of Ukrainian opposition in Berlin, in Italy, in Brazil, even in Bangladesh, in Israel by Israeli Communist Party, and of course in USA, and in Great Britain as well. We said to them, to these people, look, we need somehow to support people of USA in their struggle. And we did a lot, and we had a complete campaign. And Phil Waleto was the one who made the statement about it. Remember, Phil? So we are in solidarity with people of USA in their struggle, and we are in solidarity with people of, for instance, Latin America. We supported this elections in Peru when the socialist president was there elected, and etc. About Russia, we support all progressive left forces of Russia in their opposition struggle against the rule of capitalism, which eventually is very dangerous for Russia as well as to everybody else. The regime of now, if we speak about what is the origin, what is the character of this regime, we understand this regime in Russia as plainly Bonapartism. And if you study Bonapartism from the descriptions of 19th century, you can see that Bonapartism is type of regime which, in a sense, progressive, but it can go this way or another. And it is not only about Louis Napoleon in France in the middle of 19th century, when it eventually went into great defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, and eventually it went into first proletarian revolution of Commune of Paris. Bonapartism is more than this. But what we see now in Russia, we accept and not accept. Put it this way: if you study dialectics, we can accept something, but we can see another side of the story. We do accept that Russia tries to build inside some type of welfare state plainly by example of Scandinavian state, like Sweden, like Norway. There is high level of social, so to say, benefits for citizens of Russia. And it is very, very much hard to become citizen of Russia for migrant, as us, for instance. Take us. I spent 6 years of ongoing, not pleasant, bureaucratic processes, day after day, in order to obtain Russian citizenship, in order to stay in the country with at least get the medical, for instance, how we call it, security, medical wise. Like now I can go to hospital and have amazingly great treatment for free. So this is something to, to pay effort to. But the point is such, although Russian state becomes almost very friendly to the citizens, but in terms of workers and in terms of the economy development, it is far from perfection, put it this way. It is capitalist country, which is still with all of these processes and developments, which eventually will lead to crisis very much. And there is no way around for capitalist country. But we must admit that present day Bonapartism in Russia can be switched to progressive way. One good point about Russia, the ruling elite, they don't like opposition there. No, they don't like. They basically try not to oppress very much, but somehow move opposition to the corner. Come there to the corner. This they do more against somebody who are plainly supported by USA and England and Germany, and this, by great fortune, they do not do with communists. So communists here enjoy such a freedom. Like we participated in communist event twice today. Not plainly communist, but there was mixture. We participated in the 1st of May with happiness. We could march with red banners everywhere in the city. You cannot imagine this in Kiev. That is why we will support whoever in Russia who will demolish the regime of Kiev to the dust. It is maybe very cruel to say, but there is a principle in Afghanistan. The word of Persian Farsi language, dushman, means enemy. And there is principle, dushman dushmanoi, enemy of our enemy. Whoever is enemy of our enemy, doesn't matter, Russian, Polish, Turkish, Romanian, whoever is enemy of Kiev regime of cannibals, whoever is enemy of those cannibals is our friend. And we will only support the hands of this enemy of our enemy. Sorry, this is us. We are different. We are Ukrainian opposition. That's not, maybe not acceptable for somebody, but this is us. That's about such. Thank you very much, dear friends.
Thank you, comrade. And we are so pleased to be able to call you comrade, not just in our opposition to the ruling oligarchy, but also comrades in arms as working class revolutionaries. Sarah, Danny, would you like to say anything in closing?
Yeah, I'll say a quick remark. I just want to kind of expand on what Phil was saying, and just one thing about this conflict that I think is really hard for the US public to grasp is that it's not moralistic or absolute in any way. And that's kind of the nature of civil wars, which I think has been a big reason why it was framed when it hit the media circuits as an unprovoked invasion or just something that happened out of the blue, because that's easier to rally around. And if you flat out say there's been an ongoing civil war for 8 years and that the US and Russia are involved, you're going to start picking it apart and trying to see where it happens. I think that can be difficult for a lot of people in the US to wrap their heads around, because we're used to kind of war rhetoric being rooted in World War II and like clear morals that we can get behind. But war is not tidy, and that's not really how it goes. And when we're in this kind of situation, and you know, if somebody, like, if you make comments, like there's some comments in the chat, like, oh, Russia does not have rights to the Ukraine in a civil war that's being funded by both sides. Does the US have rights to the Ukraine? And I think no. And I think that the bigger picture, of course, is self-determination, but that's not something that can just happen if we snap our fingers and want that right now, because we're 8 years into a civil war where self-determination has been taken away and things have gotten a lot messier. And yeah, that's all I wanted to add.
I didn't know if Rich Moreno would also, who's doing the technical backup, would want to jump in on a closing remark from this discussion or not. I'll keep my, this has really been a rich discussion, went further, I think, than we even hoped, and that's healthy. It shows that there are big issues, the big questions behind what is really much more than the massacre at the House of Labor. What are the forces behind it? Who's the forces suppressing it? Where are we going from here? But it shows as soon as you raise these questions, we're talking about what's the character of Russia today, of China today, of Ukrainian opposition today. But the one thing for here in the US, I think we have to always think, what can unite us, is that we are opposed to all US imperialist wars, maneuvers, propaganda, lies, no matter how they dress it. I think if we have one clear line, then there's a broad basis for unity. And this has been true when you think even in the last 2 months, what have been the forces that have been cooperating with each other from, I want to recognize the work of the United National Anti-War Coalition, of Popular Resistance, of Sanctions Kill, of Alliance for Global Justice, and many other organizations, Hamilton Peace in Canada, and the International Manifesto Group. And I could name groups in Britain, name groups throughout the imperialist West who are together in opposing this war. And that's important. As long as we have a rock solid basis, it's an imperialist war. We're not for any aspect or any justification for it. But we can see inside come the other questions. Russia today is a capitalist country, absolutely true. It's, however, not an imperialist country. Much of it may have aspired to be. It has an economy smaller than Brazil or Canada. It's a producer mainly of raw materials. It is not a population less than half what it was under the Soviet Union, without the real planning that once made it such a powerhouse. But are we for the complete subjugation of Russia? No, we're not. We're not. We're against our own ruling class right here. And at the same time, having deep confidence that there is a really revolutionary forces in Russia that will take advantage of this crisis to strengthen working class power within Russia, just as there are opposition forces within the Ukraine that will resist under the most impossible conditions. So I think May Day, it's interesting, this comes a day after May Day. Every effort to destroy workers' movements around the world, more than 150 years, it arises again and again. Workers organize, they have no choice. They have no choice. Otherwise, they're absolutely ground into the dust. They organize and they reassert themselves again and again. And that's where we place our confidence. So thank you for both this webinar and for those who participated, those who are listening, please continue tuning in. Thank you for Phil for keeping alive the struggle, the crime committed in Odessa, reminding left forces here. And especially thank you to Leonid, who maintains really a communist perspective under the most difficult conditions. This is what communists, this is what socialists, this is what everybody who's fighting for a new future needs to do.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Phil, Leonid, Danny. You know, I just want to say that I think this conversation was so educational for me, and also I think we really did what we set out to do, which is to raise the understanding of what this conflict is really about. And I've been thinking about this because it's a year ago I visited Damascus in Syria for the first time for the presidential elections, and it was after 10 years of civil war in Syria. And really what it was a proxy war backed by the US with very, very right-wing armed militias. And it was to my shame that I fell for that propaganda back in 2011, 2012, 2013. And I saw what 10 years of war does to a country, and then thinking about how many more years it's going to take to rebuild after that US proxy war. And I now see what's happening in Ukraine, and I'm thinking about what Phil said, that we in the US have a responsibility to prevent the ruling class that's right above us from committing these horrible atrocities abroad. We don't want to let what happened in Syria happen again in Ukraine. So we have to have international solidarity. We have to keep having events like this. And I want to thank everybody for tuning in. And towards that end, there's going to be an event in Tijuana, Mexico next month. And I want everyone to check out workerssummit.org to learn about the Workers' Summit of the America that is hosted by a number of great organizations, including the International Action Center. You can go to workerssummit.org to find out more about this Workers' Summit, this conference that's going to be taking place across the border, where in San Diego, the Organization of American States is going to be meeting. This is a Workers' Summit in opposition to an imperialist summit. Thank you all so much. Leonid, thank you. Phil, Sarah, Danny, this has been great.